Ladies and gentlemen, let's be real. Stepping into a new year like 2025 feels like stepping into uncharted territory. The headlines, the uncertainties, the challenges ahead, it's enough to make anyone feel stuck. But here's the truth: God will make a way. Not might make a way, not could make a way. God will make a way. Now, before you let doubt creep in, I need you to hear this. The promise isn't that we'll avoid hardship. The promise is that God is faithful to lead us through it. Think about the Israelites standing at the edge of the Red Sea. They had an impossible situation behind them, Pharaoh's army, and an immovable obstacle in front of them, the sea. But God didn't call them to figure it out. He called them to trust that He had already made a way. In 2025, you're going to face moments when it feels like there's no way forward. Maybe it's a closed door, a diagnosis, a financial strain, or just the weight of waiting for what God has promised. But listen, God specializes in making a way where there is no way. Sometimes the way doesn't look the way you thought it would. The door you prayed would open might stay shut. But God doesn't need a door to open for His plan to unfold. He can part seas, move mountains, and create opportunities that no human hand could arrange. And when you're walking with Him, even detours are destinations in disguise. But here's the part you can't miss. Making a way is not just about divine intervention, it's also about your response. Faith isn't just believing that God will show up, it's moving forward as if He already has. It's speaking hope in the middle of despair. It's sowing seeds in a season of drought. And it's praising God while you're still waiting on the breakthrough. So here's my challenge to you for 2025. Don't let the uncertainty of what's ahead shake your confidence in the one who goes before you. Trust that God's plan is bigger than the obstacle. His timing is better than your timeline, and His ways are higher than anything you could ever imagine. God will make a way in 2025. Not just for the world, not just for others, but for you. Step into this year with boldness, knowing that you're not walking into it alone. Whatever Red Sea you're facing, the God who parts waters is still in control. Your job is to trust Him and take the next step. Because the way may not be visible yet, but the waymaker is already working. Uncertainty is often uncomfortable. It challenges our confidence, disrupts our plans, and creates a fog around what lies ahead. But here's the truth: no amount of uncertainty can ever cancel God's plan for your life. The idea that our limitations or the unpredictability of the world can derail the purpose of the Creator is simply not true. God's plan operates on a level far beyond our comprehension. He doesn't require perfect conditions to fulfill His promises, and He certainly isn't limited by the shifting sands of human circumstance. Think about this. Uncertainty is not new to God. In fact, He works best in it. Throughout some of the most extraordinary displays of His power and faithfulness occurred in the middle of uncertain and impossible situations. Abraham didn't know where he was going when God told him to leave his homeland, yet he obeyed, trusting that God's direction was enough. Joseph didn't understand why he went from a dream of leadership to being thrown into a pit and then a prison. But each step of his uncertain journey was woven into God's greater plan for him to save nations. The same God who worked through their uncertainty is working through yours. Maybe as 2025 begins, you feel like you're standing in a fog of doubt. Perhaps you're asking questions like, what's next? Or how is this going to work out? It could be a career decision you can't seem to make, a relationship that feels uncertain, or a dream that seems further away now than ever. The temptation is to think that because you can't see the path. There isn't one. But God doesn't need you to see the entire plan. He needs you to trust Him step by step. One of the most profound lessons uncertainty teaches us is that control is an illusion. We spend so much energy trying to map out every detail of our lives, only to realize that the world is full of variables beyond our control. That can be unsettling, but it's also freeing. When we release our need to control, we make room for God to do what only He can do. It's in the moments when we admit, I don't know what's next, that God says, I do. Trust me. Uncertainty also has a way of deepening our faith. It pushes us to lean not on our understanding, but on God's wisdom and guidance. When you don't know the next step, you're more likely to pray for direction. When you can't see the solution, you're more likely to trust in God's provision. And when the future feels unclear, you're more likely to cling to the promise that God is faithful to complete what He started in you. This doesn't mean uncertainty is easy to endure. It's hard to wait without answers, to move forward without clarity, and to keep trusting when nothing seems to be changing. But the good news is that God doesn't leave us alone in our uncertainty. His word reminds us that He is a lamp to our feet and a light to our path, not a floodlight showing every detail, but just enough light to take the next step. If you're facing uncertainty in 2025, remind yourself of this. God's plan for your life isn't reactive, it's proactive. He isn't scrambling to fix what you think is broken. He already knows the outcome and is actively working all things together for good. Uncertainty isn't a sign that God has abandoned you. It's an opportunity to grow closer to Him. Every time you face uncertainty, you have a choice to worry about what you can't see or to trust the one who sees everything. The path may not be clear to you, but it is perfectly clear to God. The question isn't whether there's a way forward, it's whether you will trust God enough to follow it. Remember, no matter how uncertain things feel, God's plan is secure. He has a purpose for your life that no amount of confusion, delay, or obstacle can undo. His promises are unshakable, and His faithfulness endures through every unknown. Let this truth anchor your heart as you step boldly into 2025, knowing that uncertainty doesn't cancel God's plan. It's simply part of the process. Perspective is everything. How you choose to see a situation determines how you experience it, and often whether you'll emerge stronger or more defeated. When challenges arise, it's easy to see them as roadblocks, as interruptions to your plans, or even as evidence that things are not going your way. But perspective allows us to reframe these moments and see them not as obstacles, but as opportunities, not as punishments, but as preparations. As 2025 begins, many people will face situations that don't align with their expectations. You might encounter closed doors, delayed dreams, or circumstances that seem entirely contrary to what you prayed for. It's tempting in those moments to get discouraged or to feel as though God has forgotten about you. But that's where the power of perspective comes into play. You can either look at what's happening and conclude that God isn't working, or you can choose to believe that God is working in ways you can't yet see. Consider this: a closed door isn't always rejection. Sometimes it's redirection. God sees the entire picture of your life, while we often see only a fragment. What feels like a setback may actually be the very thing positioning you for the breakthrough you've been waiting for. Perspective allows you to trust that when one path is blocked, God is faithful to provide another. He's not leaving you stuck. He's leading you into His better plan. Think about Joseph in the Bible. From the outside, his journey seemed like a series of failures, betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused and imprisoned. But Joseph's perspective kept him aligned with God's purpose. He didn't see his circumstances as the end of his story. He trusted that God was still at work. When he finally stood before his brothers years later, he was able to say, "What you intended for harm, God intended for good." That's the power of perspective, seeing God's hand even in the moments that feel like defeat. Perspective also allows you to focus on what's within your control instead of being consumed by what isn't. You may not be able to change the situation you're in, but you can change how you respond to it. You can choose gratitude over grumbling, faith over fear, and hope over despair. It's not about pretending that everything is perfect, but about recognizing that even in imperfection, God is working for your good. When we fix our perspective on God's promises rather than our problems, we begin to see challenges differently. The very things that once intimidated us lose their power when we realize they are temporary and that God's faithfulness is eternal. That diagnosis, it's not bigger than God's healing power. That financial struggle, it's not beyond His ability to provide. That delay, it's not denial, it's preparation for what's ahead. Another key to shifting your perspective is to remember God's track record in your life. Too often we allow the weight of our current circumstances to overshadow all the ways God has come through for us before. But when you pause and reflect on the times He made a way when there seemed to be none, it reminds you that He hasn't brought you this far to leave you now. Perspective keeps your focus on His faithfulness, not on your fear. Perspective doesn't come naturally, it's a discipline. It requires you to pause in the middle of difficulty and ask, what is God teaching me here? How is He using this to grow me? It might mean looking beyond your immediate discomfort and trusting that this moment is part of a bigger picture. It's not about denying reality, but about choosing to see reality through the lens of God's promises. As you move through 2025, let perspective be your guide. When you face a challenge, remind yourself that God's plan for you is still in motion. When something doesn't go the way you hope, trust that it's because He has something better in store. And when you feel overwhelmed by what's in front of you, take a step back and ask God to show you His perspective. Because here's the truth, what you focus on expands. If you focus on what's missing, what's wrong, or what's uncertain, those things will consume you. But if you focus on God's faithfulness, His promises, and His provision, you'll find peace, even in the middle of the storm. That's the power of perspective. It doesn't change the situation, it changes you. When we think about God's promises, we often imagine the fulfillment, the joy, the breakthrough, the moment when everything falls into place. But what we sometimes overlook is the process that leads to the promise. God's promises are certain, but His timing and the preparation required to reach them are equally important. The truth is, God often uses seasons of waiting and preparation to shape us and refine us so that we're ready to step into what He has planned. Preparation isn't always glamorous, and it rarely feels exciting. It's the behind-the-scenes work that no one sees, the unseen faithfulness that builds the character necessary to carry the promise. Think about a seed planted in the ground. For a time, it looks like nothing is happening. The surface remains undisturbed, but beneath the soil, roots are growing and establishing a foundation for what will one day break through and bear fruit. That's what preparation looks like, growth that often feels invisible but is essential for the promise to take root and flourish. Look at the story of David in the Bible. He was anointed as king when he was still a young shepherd, but he didn't ascend to the throne immediately. Instead, he spent years tending sheep, fighting lions and bears, and later serving King Saul. At first glance, it might seem like David was wasting time or that God's promise was delayed. But those years were not wasted, they were preparation. The same skills and character traits David developed as a shepherd and servant were the very qualities he needed to lead a nation. In your own life, you might feel like you're stuck in a season of waiting. Maybe you've been praying for a breakthrough, a new job, a relationship healing, or clarity, and it feels like nothing is happening. But what if this season isn't about inactivity, but intentional preparation? What if God is using this time to develop in you the strength, wisdom, or faith required to steward the promise He has for you? Sometimes God's delays are not denials, they are divine strategies to equip you for what's ahead. Preparation often involves refining, which isn't always comfortable. It might mean letting go of old habits, toxic relationships, or limiting beliefs that would hinder you from stepping into the fullness of God's promise. It could involve learning patience, building resilience, or deepening your faith in ways that only challenges can accomplish. Remember, God is more interested in your growth than your comfort. He cares about who you're becoming because who you are will determine how you handle what He entrusts to you. Another key aspect of preparation is faithfulness in the present. Sometimes we're so focused on the promise that we neglect what's right in front of us. But God often uses our current circumstances as the training ground for what's next. Are you being faithful with the opportunities, relationships, and responsibilities you have today? David didn't wait to become king to start leading. He led with courage and integrity while tending sheep and serving others. Similarly, your faithfulness in the little things today prepares you for the greater things tomorrow. It's also important to understand that preparation isn't passive. Waiting on God doesn't mean sitting back and doing nothing. It means actively trusting Him while continuing to grow, serve, and obey. Noah didn't wait for the rain to start building the ark. He built it in faith, trusting God's word even when the promise hadn't materialized yet. Preparation is about taking steps of faith, even when you don't see the full picture, because you trust that God is working behind the scenes. As you step into 2025, consider what areas of your life God might be preparing for His promises. Are there lessons you need to learn, habits you need to develop, or steps of faith you need to take? Instead of growing frustrated in the waiting, ask God to show you what He's doing in this season. Remember that preparation isn't punishment, it's proof of God's love. He's not holding back His promises to withhold joy from you. He's preparing you to fully receive and sustain them. The promise is coming, but preparation is essential. Trust that God's timing is perfect and that every moment of preparation is working for your good. When the promise finally comes, you'll look back on this season and realize that everything you went through was necessary to make you ready for the blessing. Fear is a natural response to uncertainty, challenges, and the unknown. It's a reaction we all experience, especially when faced with situations that feel beyond our control. But while fear may be a natural feeling, faith is a supernatural choice. Choosing faith over fear is not about denying reality or pretending that challenges don't exist. It's about deciding to trust in God's promises, even when the circumstances seem overwhelming. Fear whispers that the worst will happen, that you're not enough, or that the challenges you face are insurmountable. It paralyzes progress and keeps you focused on what might go wrong. But faith calls you to rise above those whispers, to remember that God's power is greater than your greatest fears. Faith isn't the absence of fear, it's the courage to move forward in spite of it. Throughout the Bible, God's people were constantly faced with situations where fear could have derailed them. Think about Joshua leading the Israelites into the promised land. The land was filled with giants, fortified cities, and countless unknowns. Fear could have stopped them before they ever started, but God's command to Joshua was clear: be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid, do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go, Joshua 1:9. That same command applies to us today. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to trust in God's presence and power over the fear that threatens to hold us back. In your own life, fear might show up in different ways. Maybe it's fear of failure, fear for rejection, or fear of the future. Perhaps you're afraid of stepping out in faith because the path ahead is unclear. But fear doesn't get the final say, faith does. Faith reminds you that even when you don't know what's next, God does. Faith says that no matter how big the challenge, God is bigger. Faith declares that the same God who has been faithful before will be faithful again. Choosing faith over fear isn't always easy, but it is always worth it. It begins with a decision to shift your focus. Fear focuses on the problem, magnifying it until it feels impossible to overcome. Faith, however, focuses on the problem solver. When you fix your eyes on God instead of the storm, you begin to see His power, His promises, and His provision more clearly. Peter experienced this firsthand when he walked on water toward. As long as his focus was on, he did the impossible. But the moment he shifted his gaze to the wind and waves, fear took over and he began to sink. The lesson is clear. Where you place your focus determines whether you'll sink or stand. Faith over fear also requires remembering God's track record in your life. How many times has He already shown up for you? How many prayers has He answered? Doors has He opened and battles has He fought on your behalf? When fear tries to convince you that this time is different, let your faith remind you that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He hasn't failed you before, and He won't start now. Another important aspect of choosing faith over fear, speaking God's truth over your situation. Fear thrives on lies that you're alone, that you're not capable, that there's no way out. But God's word tells a different story. It declares that you are more than a conqueror. Romans 8:37, that He will never leave you nor forsake you. Deuteronomy 31:6, and that His plans for you are good. Jeremiah 29:11. When fear rises, counter it with the truth of Scripture. Speak God's promises over your life until they become louder than the fears in your mind. As you face 2025, you'll likely encounter moments when fear tries to take over. But in those moments, remember that fear is not from God. Scripture reminds us that God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and a sound mind. 2 Timothy 1:7. That means you have the power to overcome fear, the love to trust God's heart, and the sound mind to make decisions rooted in faith, not panic. Faith doesn't mean you won't feel fear. It means fear won't control you. It means stepping forward even when the outcome is uncertain, trusting that God's plan is greater than your greatest worry. In 2025, let faith be your anchor, your guide, and your response to every situation that tries to stir up fear. Because with God on your side, there's nothing to fear and everything to hope for. No one is meant to journey through life alone. From the very beginning, God designed us for a relationship with Him and with one another. Community isn't just a nice addition to life, it's essential. When we face challenges, uncertainties, or even victories, the people around us play a vital role in shaping our perspective, encouraging our faith, and helping us move forward. In 2025, the importance of community cannot be overstated, especially as you navigate the path God has set before you. Life can be overwhelming at times. The weight of decisions, the struggles of daily life, and the doubts that creep in during moments of uncertainty can all feel heavy. But community is God's gift to lighten that load. Ecclesiastes 4:9-10 reminds us, 2 are better than one because they have a good return for their labor. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up. Community is there to catch you when you stumble, to encourage you when you feel like giving up, and to celebrate with you when you succeed. The role of community goes beyond mere companionship. It's about accountability and growth. The right community will challenge you to become the person God has called you to be. They'll speak truth in love, even when it's uncomfortable, and encourage you to live in alignment with God's purpose. They'll remind you of His promises when fear or doubt clouds your vision. A good community doesn't let you settle for less than God's best. They push you forward in faith, even when you feel stuck. But let's be honest, community isn't always easy. Building meaningful relationships requires vulnerability, effort, and a willingness to invest in others. It means opening up about your struggles, allowing others to see your imperfections, and choosing to trust even when it feels risky. True community doesn't happen overnight. It's built over time through shared experiences, mutual support, and intentional connection. In the Bible, the early church in Acts is a beautiful illustration of what happens when people come together in unity. They shared their resources, supported one another, and grew stronger in their faith because they were committed to doing life together. They didn't just meet occasionally, they lived in fellowship, bearing each other's burdens and rejoicing in each other's victories. That kind of community is still possible today, but it requires intentionality. One of the greatest benefits of community is that it helps combat isolation. When we face challenges, the temptation is often to withdraw, to isolate ourselves and try to figure things out alone. But isolation is where doubts grow and fears fester. Community, on the other hand, brings light to the darkness. It offers perspective when you're too close to the situation to see clearly. It reminds you that you're not alone, that others have walked similar paths, and that God is still at work, even when it feels like nothing is changing. Community also plays a vital role in helping you discern God's voice and direction. Sometimes when you're praying for guidance, God will speak through the people around you. A wise friend, a mentor, or a small group leader might offer insight or encouragement that confirms what God has been trying to show you. Their perspective can provide clarity and assurance in moments of doubt. As you step into 2025, ask yourself, who is in my community? Do I have people who encourage my faith, challenge me to grow, and stand by me in tough times? And just as importantly, are you that kind of person for others? Community is a two-way street. It's not just about receiving support. It's about offering it. Be intentional about building relationships that honor God and reflect His love. Maybe you're thinking, I don't have that kind of community right now. If so, take heart. It's never too late to start. Pray for God to bring the right people into your life. Seek out opportunities to connect, whether through church, small groups, or other faith-based gatherings. And remember, building community takes time, but the investment is worth it. In 2025, let community be one of your greatest strengths. Lean on the people God has placed in your life and allow them to lean on you. Together you can face challenges, celebrate victories, and grow closer to the God who created you for relationship. Because in the end, life is better when we do it together. One of the greatest challenges in life is learning to trust God's timing. As human beings, we are often impatient, wanting things to happen on our schedule in the way we envision and at the pace we think is best. Yet God operates on a timeline that is far beyond our understanding. His ways are higher than ours, and His timing is always perfect, even when it feels delayed. Trusting God's timing requires surrender, faith, and a deep belief that He is working all things for your good. Life often doesn't unfold the way we expect. Prayers seem unanswered. Opportunities seem to pass us by, and the waiting season can feel like an eternity. But what if the waiting isn't wasted? What if God is doing something far greater in the delay than you could imagine in the moment? Trusting His timing begins with the understanding that God sees the entire picture of your life. He knows the end from the beginning and orchestrates every detail with purpose. The Bible is filled with examples of people who had to trust God's timing even when it didn't make sense. Abraham was promised a son, but he waited decades before Isaac was born. During that waiting period, he had to trust that God would fulfill His promise, even when circumstances seemed impossible. Similarly, Joseph endured years of slavery and imprisonment before stepping into the role God had prepared for him. From the outside, it might have seemed like God had forgotten His promise, but in reality, every moment was part of the preparation for Joseph's destiny. Trusting God's timing doesn't mean passively waiting, it means actively believing. It means holding on to His promises, even when there's no evidence that they're coming to pass. It's about choosing faith over frustration, hope over despair, and peace over anxiety. When you trust God's timing, you begin to see delays not as denials, but as divine appointments. You start to understand that what feels like a no is often a not yet, and the waiting season is where God does some of His most profound work in your life. One of the keys to trusting God's timing is surrendering your control. It's natural to want to take matters into your own hands when things aren't happening as quickly as you'd like. But when you try to force something to happen outside of God's timing, it rarely leads to the results you desire. Instead, it often brings frustration and unnecessary struggle. Surrendering doesn't mean giving up. It means trusting that God's plan is better than anything you could orchestrate on your own. Another aspect of trusting God's timing is learning to wait with gratitude. It's easy to become consumed by what you're waiting for and lose sight of what God is already doing in your life. Gratitude shifts your focus from what's missing to what's present. It reminds you of God's faithfulness in the past and gives you confidence that He'll come through again. When you cultivate gratitude in the waiting, you create space for peace and joy, even in the midst of uncertainty. Trusting God's timing also means embracing the lessons He's teaching you along the way. Every season of waiting is an opportunity for growth. Maybe God is teaching you patience, refining your character, or deepening your faith. Perhaps He's protecting you from something you can't yet see or preparing you for something greater than you imagined. When you trust that there's purpose in the process, you can endure the waiting with hope instead of frustration. It's important to remember that God's delays are not a sign of His absence. Just because you don't see movement doesn't mean He's not working. God often works behind the scenes, arranging circumstances, opening doors, and aligning people and opportunities in ways you can't yet perceive. Trusting His timing means believing that He's always working, even when you don't see the evidence. As you step into 2025, you might find yourself in a season of waiting. Perhaps you're waiting for a breakthrough, an answer to prayer, or clarity about your next step. In those moments, remind yourself that God is never late. He's not in a hurry, but He's never behind schedule. His timing is perfect and His plans for you are good. Choose to trust His timing, even when it doesn't align with your own. Rest in the knowledge that the God who created the universe is the same God who holds your future. When the time is right, He will make a way. Until then, trust that He's working, growing, and preparing you for what's to come. Because when you trust God's timing, you position yourself to receive His best at exactly the right moment.